Thanks for our to you guys joining our webinar today. The topic we'll be discussing today is how to make the best out of working with a recruiting firm. And yeah, I'm really excited to share some best practices around preparing the work with a recruiting firm, and then also have a deep dive into really industry insights for the recruiting industry. But
no holding back.
Yeah, no holding back.
That was the deal. Don't hold back. Okay.
So before we jump in, I'd like to give Angelina the stage to introduce herself.
Perfect. Yeah, thanks, Ben. Yeah, excited to tackle this topic for sure. My company is Acework. We are a recruiting firm, a talent partner for remote first and remote only companies, working on roles from anything across engineering, product, but also marketing, sales, HR. Often it's tech companies and scale-ups, but as I said, always with a remote focus. And I know there are a lot of different remote recruiting firms, or generally recruiting firms out there selling different types of services. So I hope that today we can bring some clarity into how to make the best out of engaging one, how to choose the right one. And maybe give some tips of how we've worked in the past with clients.
Yeah, and I can already promise you there's a lot of very, very interesting stuff coming up in Angelina's part. Quick 2 words about myself. My name is Benjamin. I am the principal consultant at SMB Consulting. We help smaller companies, often remote only, in optimizing operations and organizational structures. So everything from who sits in which seat, job profiles, but also, how do you bring on the right people? How do you define the roles that you're looking for? And then moving on to things like management systems, process design, and all these kind of things, because especially for small organizations, these things are always connected, right? You can't separate one from the other. So we believe that having this holistic consulting approach about everything that happens within the company borders is the only way to go. So before we get started, I would be very interested to hear what questions you might have about recruiting and working with a recruiting firm. Right. So if you like, put in the answers to these questions in the chat. Have you worked with a recruiter before? And if yes, have you been successful? And the second question is, what questions would you like answered to make this webinar a great use of your time? Feel free to just put them in the chat as the answers flow in, no rush. And the same is true for any questions that might come up during the webinar. Please just put them into the chat. And we'll have some time reserved at the end to discuss these questions and go into detail with what's interesting for you. Okay. Angelina, anything to add before we dive right in?
Ready to start.
Awesome. Okay, so what we have set up for you today is that we want to talk about preparation first. So what are the things that you have to do before engaging a recruiting firm, or really before searching for any candidate, right? With whatever tool might be in-house recruiting or recruiting firm, right? So what is the preparation work necessary to really start an effective and efficient recruiting process? And then Angelina will tell us a bit more about how to select the right recruiting firm, which is really the pinnacle of making it a successful endeavor. Because if you go wrong with that first choice, you're going to have a hard time in finding a successful outcome. And lastly, we talk about collaboration. So how do you engage with a recruiting firm? What feedback do they need? How do you work with them? What's the relationship like, right? And there's a lot of insights from Angelina. So let's dive right in. And again, questions in the chat. But first of all, I'd like to share those numbers here to stress how important the topic is. 20%. 20% is, this is first-hand information from Angelina, is the share of roles that a recruiting firm might take on from clients that are actually being filled, right? So that number is not really high. That does not mean that only 20% of all recruiting of all roles that people give to recruiting firms are filled, but it just shows you that the success quote is rather low, right? And this has multiple reasons, and there's huge leverage to increase that number to a much, much higher number, right? So Angelina will talk a bit about that. Then second number is 3.5x. And 3.5x is the factor by which you can multiply the yearly salary if you want to calculate the loss that you will incur if you choose a bad person, or a bad hire. It doesn't have to be a bad person, but the wrong person for the job, right? So estimates go up to 3.5 at the annual salary that it will cost you if you hire the wrong person, right? So you got to get this right. And lastly, 8 to 12. 8 to 12 weeks is the average project duration for any role that a recruiting firm will try to fill, which means that long you will have to be engaged in the process. So it's a lot of time spent also on your end as being the client. And on the other hand, it's all the time you have, right? If you can't close the deal after these 8 to 12 weeks, chances are that you aren't going to be successful with your recruiting. So that being said, it's very, very important to get the recruiting stuff, the recruiting briefing right for the firm. And let's jump right into what is all needed for briefing. So at the core of what the recruiting firm will need from you and what you have to prepare is the job description and the job scorecard. And I'll talk about that in a second a bit more. Also, so this is the core, right? I think it's very obvious. The job description is very clear. You need to tell the recruiting firm what role you want to fill, right? The scorecard will tell you what are the major outcomes that this role has to achieve in usually the first year, right? There are a few things surrounding this core element that you need to hand over. Some of them you have to define, others you just have to become aware or explicit about, right? So you might have a culture already, but the recruiting firm doesn't know it, and neither does the candidate. And now you have the recruiting firm between you and the candidate. So you gotta be expressive about what your culture is, right? So culture is one thing you have to be clear about. Your company vision and roadmap, the budget that you have for the role, and also, whether it's a fixed budget, is it, are you flexible on budget? How do you want to structure payments, etc., etc. Is it a part-time role or a full-time role? Is it remote versus on-site? And what's the timeline? And underlying to all of these things is the employer brand, right? And this is nothing you can build up once you start looking for a recruiting firm, because this is a long-term thing you need to build, right? There's multiple things that go into it. But for today, we want to focus on these green and yellow items. And I want to walk you through how you can develop them, or how you can define them to hand them over to a recruiting firm, or also to use them for your internal recruiting if that's what you're up to. So first of all, the company roadmap is, pretty much the main input for your recruiting needs, right? So you'll have a growth trajectory, you have strategic goals that you've defined, and these strategic goals and this growth trajectory ideally translates into some form of roadmap that you have, right? So you will have an idea of where you want your company to be in 3, 6, 12 months, potentially 2 or 3 years. So there are steps involved. And the first thing we recommend doing is build out your target org structure, right? If you think about your strategic goal horizon, which might be 1 year, think about what your organization will look like in 1 year. What organizational structure is necessary to accomplish the state of business you want to have in 1 year's time. And this will leave you with a gap between today and 1 year's time. And this is this recruiting roadmap then that you can fill with the positions that are new in the target org structure, right? So this today, you add yellow and light blue, and then you have to decide when will you hire for yellow and light blue, because it will not happen in Q3 in 1 year's time, because then it's going to be too late, right? You will need these positions earlier to arrive at this stage. So the recruiting roadmap forces you to allocate hiring with strategic or operational milestones along the way, right? Once you have fleshed out what you will hire for when, it's time to dig into more detail. And what we recommend is develop your role or your job description, which includes the role, basically a short description of why does this person or this role exist in the company? Why do we need this job? What is this job for, right? What responsibilities does this job have? Think about outcomes, really, right? So if you want somebody to drive sales, then there's a responsibility, and then break it down into tasks, which is more like, call clients, right? or maintain the CRM or whatever, right? So that's the operationalization of responsibilities. And then if you like, also add qualifications, right? If you need certain industry experience, you can add that. From our internal perspective, it's not a must to have that, because also the recruiting firm can help you develop expectations for qualification. And for everything that we develop here, one thing is very true: there probably will be a back and forth between you and the recruiting firm, right? It's you have initial expectations that you hand over, and then there must be a collaborative approach to, refining it. So this is the job descriptions that you can that you should develop, and then also the scorecard. And the scorecard is really, again, taking your strategic goals and translating it into what does each job or each role have to accomplish, right? So if your goal is growing it's not your goal, but one of the parts of your strategy would be growing an engineering team from 5 to 20 people, and you're looking for a CTO, right? In their job scorecard, it will probably read something like, hire 15 world-class developers in the next 12 months, right? So it's operationalizing your strategic goals into what is relevant for one role. Okay, and you do that for all the roles. This combination of role description or job description and the job scorecard. And once you have this, you pretty much have, let's say, 70%, 60% of the input that a recruiting firm will need to get started on the job. But it's really only 60 or 70%, right? You see it here at the bottom. We have timeline now, because you know when to hire for it. We have the roadmap for your company, right? So before you can do this exercise, you have to understand where your company is going. So also being explicit about that and having an understanding of where you want to grow is important. You have the job description and the scorecard. So next on, we need to talk about culture, location, and vision. So basically, it's a very simple concept, but it's important to become clear about that and not be driven by availability. And I say this because we've seen clients a lot shaping their needs by what they find in the market, which might be a last resort, but as a starting point, it's not a good idea. You'd rather want to be very explicit and intentional about what you're hiring for. And if you can't find the talent that you need in the market, then you can adapt, right? But there's no point in, if you're not a remote company, and you have trouble with engaging only on a digital basis, and your team has, then hiring remote talent might be challenging, right? So being intentional about these decisions is very important, and it's just a good, exercise to become clear about these things before you engage with a recruiter. And also, as Angelina will tell you later, it's very critical about which recruiter to choose to become clear about these things. So first of all, is location. Are you hiring remote? Are you hiring location specific? And also, if you're hiring remote, the thing is that remote can mean many different things, right? Remote can mean worldwide. Remote can mean in a specific location, which is not my own, right? So offshore. And remote can also mean in a certain, set of geographies. For example, EST time zone, CET time zone. Or somewhat around plus or minus 2 hours around Berlin time, whatever, right? So there might be different constraints, but really thinking that through and understanding what would fit your way of working in the organization, what delay or shift in time zones could you live with, is really critical. Obviously, this decision is a bit easier when it's location specific, but also here, what does location specific really mean? I mean, are you hiring for one specific location? Is it for one office? Do you maybe have another office where this person could work? So is it 2 locations? So thinking this through is really important. Next up, and I mentioned this before, culture. So basically the question, who are you as an employer, and what can the candidate expect? And I've put the scale here because what we've seen quite a bit is that when clients hire or brief recruiting firms, they oftentimes become very aspirational about their culture. They describe the culture in terms of aspiration, in terms of a future ideal state, right? The problem with that is that if the deviation or the gap between what is and what you want to be is too big, and you bring on a candidate that buys into your description of the future state, and they come into a company that looks and feels totally different, it's going to be a problem, right? People will not, will have a harder time adjusting and will probably not settle in well, right? So try to strike a balance here. There's always a bit of an aspirational component to culture descriptions, but when you describe the culture to the recruiter, try to strike a balance and be really honest with yourself. And one thing that can help you is ask your team members about what your culture is like. There's multiple guidelines out there on how to establish or examine what culture is like. So use your team, try to get third-party opinion where your team is not really third-party, but try to get an opinion about culture from people that are not yourself, right? Just to get an objectified view on what culture really is. And then lastly, the company vision. The question is, where are you going with the company? There are two components to it. One is really the question of purpose, which is, in the current labor market with labor shortage and the talent being on the stronger side of the table, oftentimes people are looking for purpose, right? You know that. And the clearer you are on what your vision is for the company and the clearer you are in spelling out why you exist and what positive change you're there to make in the world, the better. And also here, it's very important to be realistic because, if you're, there's different types of visions. There's the, the selfless type of vision. I want to make the world a better place in doing this and that. Great. If your vision is to become the market leader in lead generation agencies for this and that, then this is also a vision, right? But you got to be clear about that, because if you promise a lofty, world-improving vision to a candidate, and in reality it's hard business and numbers are the only thing that count in your organization, there will be a disconnect, and this will cause problems, right? So becoming clear about what the vision of the company is very important. The other aspect of this is, again, the roadmap that we were discussing earlier. And, besides the specific roadmap that you can already tell your client, your candidates, right, in terms of your role will develop into this and that over the next 2 or 3 years, especially important for, leadership roles where you say your team might be small or non-existent now, but we want you to build a team, so you will have a lot of leadership responsibilities. That's very important for the candidate, obviously. But the vision ties into that in a bit more long term, where it's important to understand what your aspirations are with the company, so the candidate knows about whether they're engaging in a high growth, competitive, scaling fast environment, or if it is a slower, I don't know, maybe more profit or value driven, more steady, more stable environment, right? So the vision is an extension of the company roadmap, but both of these future projections are very important for your candidates to understand. So spell them out. And again, especially for culture and vision, we see that many of the clients themselves are not clear about what culture and vision is for them. The next step is that the recruiter doesn't know it, so you have to brief them, and you have to brief them thorough enough and spend enough time with them that they are able to then talk with the candidates about it, or find or identify the right candidates that might be a good fit, right? So there's multiple gaps that you need to bridge here, and the first step to doing this effectively is spelling it out and becoming clear about it yourself. Last but not least, the very technical stuff, where it's really the question of what is the scope of the role? Is it a part-time? Is it full-time? Is it flexible? Is it, are there maybe, again, developments in the role? Would you start part-time and develop it into full-time as you grow, right? So becoming clear about what you need and also what you can afford is part of the exercise as well. And then also, especially in high growth mode where cash flow is tricky sometimes, be clear on whether or not your cash flow can accommodate what you're trying to achieve, and balance, balance that in terms of what does the market ask for a candidate like the one you're looking for, and can your cash flow really accommodate that, also in different types of scenarios. So really cash flow, as you know, for all fast growing companies is king. And besides cash flow, obviously, always ask yourself the question, is it worth it? So what's the ROI? What's the return on investment for me bringing on that role? Because you see, there might be different ROIs. One might be monetary, the other one might be non-monetary. Where monetary is very clear, you bring on a head of sales and increase the sales by 200%, was worth it, right? If your sales are profitable enough. The other thing might just be that, and you might have experienced that, if you're running in high growth mode, your team is underwater, stressed out, everybody's doing the extra mile to make it work, but people are exhausted, and it's taking their toll on them. So then adding another person might not necessarily add to the bottom line, but might just add to the mood in the company, right? Which might be important as well, and will be a sign of culture, right? To make sure there's enough headcount to accomplish what you want to accomplish. So these are the things that you need: timeline. When do I want to hire? When do I need to close this? And also then when do I need to start, right? Roadmap to tell people what their role will be like in a few years and what your company will be like in a few years. Job description and the scorecard as really the core of the briefing for the recruiting firm. The location, culture, and vision. So basically, who are we as a company and how do we work? Where do we work? And then what is it like to work here? And then budget and scope, really just to double check for yourself, do the numbers play out, right? All of these things you take and then decide, do I need a recruiting firm or not? And Angelina will tell us a bit more about what kind of recruiting firm is best, but this will be the input for any type of recruiting, regardless of external or internal. But as Angelina has told me before, and I've heard lots of confirmation for this, a good external recruiter beats the internal cost of recruiting anytime. So I think let's dive into what a recruiting firm might do with this information. Angelina, stage is yours.
Absolutely. Thank you for re-quoting that. I think the ROI is a good moment to start here, because once you have the ROI of the position, you also know exactly what it costs you to not fill that position every month that it is vacant, right? So you almost find that need or the speed of hiring that you need to achieve to really generate that ROI. And that is where a recruiting firm can help you, right? Like, it can be speed. Absolutely. Recruiting firms can be much faster. So filling the role just, let's say, 12 weeks faster than you would have done it on your own can already, make that money that you spend on the recruiting firm calculate into your ROI. The person's on board now, your head of sales can hit the ground running. You basically paid off your recruitment firm just by placing quickly. It can also be in the sense of the cost of the bad hire that Ben mentioned that at the beginning. It can be up to 3.5% of the annual salary of the person. And when you work with an expert recruiter, you really reduce the cost or the likelihood of those bad hires that you can bring on board, because you don't rely on whatever comes in, picking out of what is available to you in the market. You really expand your talent pool and can get truly the right person for that role. But that said, that is of course a decision, right? Am I going to bring on the external recruiter or not? I would always look at the ROI. Is the role vacant, or how much ROI am I missing out on by keeping the role vacant? And then you go out and you look at the recruiting firms and you see that this is one number that I know on top of my head. Apologies if you're not from the UK, but in the UK there are about 35,000 recruiting firms and individual freelancers working and competing in this market. So it is huge. It is also highly fragmented. It's one of the most fragmented markets at all in services, much more than strategy consulting, for example, which is already very fragmented, as Ben knows. Recruiting is worse. There are a couple of big firms, but really the majority is about different niche firms, different locations, verticals, industries, you name it. Especially in the UK, I'm super fascinated with that market. Acework is based technically in Berlin. We're originally founded here, but we are a global firm. with recruiters across different continents. And what I wanted to show you, and I'm not one to bash other recruiters usually, like I've said, there are a lot of great ones out there, but what you often see these days is that I call them generic recruiting firm has something like this. I just took this as a screenshot on a website, which is just the 3 most recent blog articles of this recruiting firm. The first one is about to improve your remote hiring strategy. And the third one is celebrating the first day at their new headquarters, which is clearly where everybody works. So the question that you can already see is here is it's a company that works fully on site. I'm sure they've got work from home, flexibility and all those things, but then they're giving advice to like positioning themselves in the remote hiring industry. And I think that is quite a dangerous thing, because as a company, you really need to find the recruiter that fits with your needs and tend maybe to avoid the ones that are trying to do it all, as in we do on-site and we also do remote hiring. The way I kind of clustered it now is on the next slide, which is basically showing you that each role that you have may have specific requirements in terms of location, industry, niche skills, and so on. And as Ben mentioned earlier, being clear about what you are as a company, but also what you require in that role is very important. And once you have that, it's really quite easy to figure out what kind of recruiting firm am I looking for? And you can, as simple as Google for that. But of course, you can also tap into your network. The first one here in blue are basically all the roles that need a specific location and or a specific location with an industry or a niche skill set attached. So when you look at a specific location, local markets can be tricky, right? Especially if they're not a top location, like London, New York, and so on, but it's smaller locations. If you're really looking for a candidate in a specific location, it's really best to go with an agency that has a headquarter there or recruits mostly there. And you can find that on their open jobs or for candidates section where you often see locations as well, right? So an example for this would be you would need a project analyst or project manager in Washington, DC, right? Like I'd always recommend to find a local agency, mostly recruiting in DC, that you can then tap into that, right? They leverage the local networks, they've got market insights, they know your competitors for talent in that specific market, which is a hyper-local environment. When you've got another layer added to that, right? You're not just looking for a general project manager, but you may be looking for a senior marketing manager who has experience in the food industry, maybe ideally plant-based foods in that sector. And that person needs to be in London, right? For us, that's not a role that we take because we're remote first, obviously. But my recommendation there would be to find a UK-based agency. It doesn't have to be London, but UK-based, specialized in food and maybe as well marketing roles or just in marketing roles. So I think there you can then again see how that fits together with the local network, local market insights. But if you look at any of the roles that can be remote first, very flexible, and even in a specific industry, it is super important that you choose an agency that has a global network and global markets and an overview of the global market insights and the trends. They must have cultural awareness, right? Must be a diverse team, and really understand what the employer value proposition is for a remote first team, right? The example for that could be you're looking for a DevOps engineer, maybe with a time zone restriction, right? It can't be anywhere in the world, but time zone restriction ±3 hours around Central European. That gives you a big market already, but you can't just rely on the fact that, oh, now I've got a big talent pool, I'll find someone in that. If you really choose an agency that is great at finding people in that in a remote space, they can help you find someone that fits with your culture and your vision, that leverages those global networks, and really use an advanced sourcing strategy to unsurface not just the top level of candidates, but really dig deep, right? With COVID, this has certainly changed. Like we were a company that has always done remote roles. Now there are much more that do it. But I really urge you to look also in like, how does the agency operate, right? Are they fully remote? Are they culturally diverse? They have an understanding of different languages, barriers like this. We've done that for different companies that are maybe fully remote, right? Like examples of that would be Sendwave. Over 500 people don't have an office. Same for Close. There's also companies that still have a headquarter, but then that using that as a hub and then going further. Yeah, and basically they're really focusing on finding a remote first recruiter that fits those needs as well. A last note that I wanted to say here, which is something that doesn't happen too often, right? I know every company has very few of those C-level positions, which we call executive search, if you want, which was definitely, the most common thing in headhunting, executive search. And there you really got to look at a recruiter that has the network of people that you need, because top managers are very resistant to talk to people who are outside of their network. So if you look for support for C-level positions, really look for a recruiter that has a strong network. That can be in one position, or if it's remote, look for someone who's got that remote network as well. But that's definitely a tricky one and a tough one, and I find executive search works best through networks. Okay, moving on to the next slide. So, sorry, Ben, for having you skip back there. Which is basically different recruitment models. This is also something that I get asked a lot. And there are really many, many more models out there. The cool thing is that recruiting has really advanced in the last 5 to 10 years. So there are many more different models to choose from, many more different specializations as well. But when you look at recruitment firms, I really want to give you 2 red flags that you can look out for straight from the bat. Pretty much the first one is if a recruiter only asks for a job description and then starts sourcing and to present candidates, it's generally a bad sign. And the second one is if a recruiter sends you CVs via email, which is not GDPR compliant, but also just a sign that the processes aren't aligned. Just asking for the job description initially sounds great, right? As a company or as a client, you don't have much to do. You have that job description ready, you send it over, you magically get a couple of great CVs. Generally, it's not how it works. And it just shows that the recruiter doesn't take the time to really get to know you and understand what your requirements really are. And then chances are that you'll look at a couple of candidates that aren't the best fit. What can happen, and what we do a lot as well, is in that getting to know each other phase, in the briefing phase, we look at a couple of profiles together and understand the feedback from the client. Basically presenting a profile, can just be a LinkedIn profile, and understand how the hiring manager reads it and what they like and what they don't like. And based on that, we can adjust. But if a recruiter just sends you CVs and presents them as candidates without a proper briefing, usually a bad sign. All right, so for recruitment models, it really is also, you've done the prep work that Ben has described. Consider the level of engagement that you need, your budget that you have, and the role type. The first one here in, I guess it's turquoise, for those who are colorblind, the first one furthest on the left, is contingent recruitment, as we call it, which is probably the most classic model that most people know and associate with recruitment agencies or recruitment firms, which is to pay a fee once you hire somebody for an open position, right? One-time fee, often that's a percentage of a salary or of the candidate's annual salary, or it can also be fixed. That's on a role-by-role basis, right? You get one position, you fill it, you get that fee. That can be both exclusive, just working with one agency, or non-exclusive. Both of these can be contingent. From our experience, and we're doing this type of recruitment still, this works best if the role is really non-critical and fairly easy to fill, right? And there's not a big time pressure, the requirements are clear, then contingent recruitment works really well. But it doesn't work for a lot of other roles. So anything that's a bit harder to fill, niche skill set, senior roles, with contingent recruitment, if you spread that, especially to multiple agencies, or you don't give an agency an exclusive there, they'll often, focus on it for maybe a month. And if they don't find that it's easy to fill for them, they will deprioritize the role and work on other ones. There are so many open positions out there. There are so many companies hiring that's really how contingent recruiters have to hedge their bets when they fill, because they work on a risk basis, right? So here you don't really get that buy-in from the recruiter if you really need to fill a role. But you've got other options, right? You work with your external recruiter. You can choose something, for example, that is called RPO, which means recruitment process outsourcing. It's not a very nice name, in my opinion. But basically what it means, it is you bring on someone on a semi-permanent basis to handle your recruiting needs, almost as close as an in-house recruiter. There are different levels of this, right? You can really embed somebody fully, that they take on internal HR recruitment tasks, recruitment coordination with the hiring managers. Often that works on a monthly retainer. I would say it's a lot of companies do that on subscription models with very flexible terms, which I think is great. It's, of course, I would say exclusive because you assign that recruiter specific roles and they work like an in-house recruiter on those positions. To me, that works best when you have volume hiring, right? And hiring for multiple people in the same role, and you cover those peak hiring periods. Of course, every company knows this a couple of times a year. You kind of want to hire a little bit faster, a little bit more, and bringing on someone as an external semi-permanent recruiter really is a great option there. Third option here, which we work on a lot with roles that are, as I mentioned, critical or time-sensitive, very urgent roles, senior positions, but also confidential hires. So maybe you have to let somebody go, but they haven't been let go yet, but you need to fill the role again, or backfills when someone has left and you need to fill a role, you know, and maybe also for a niche skill set, or even just benchmarking in an intransparent market, right, where you don't really know what the candidate market looks like. It's really best to engage your recruitment agency or your firm on a retained assignment, right? That can be lots of different models actually, but generally it is still a success fee upon hire that has a financial commitment upon the commencement of the project, right? That is an exclusive assignment. You can really be sure that the recruiter digs deep, finds the right candidates for you, adjusts with you, and doesn't drop you after a month or 6 weeks when it is proven to be a tough to fill role. So there you really got that commitment and you can count on the role getting filled in the time that you want. All right, so these are the 3 models that I wanted to present in a very brief overview here. The general pricing for them can be quite different. I put some numbers here, but I've seen really few and far between. As I said, there are so many firms out there doing very different models. I would say in contingent, what I've seen most is anything between maybe 15% of the candidate salary up to anything but 40. In executive search, I've seen that for sure. Depends on the seniority, of course, the complexity of the role, the recruiter setup, can also be a fixed fee as well. RPO, same thing. I've seen it usually starting around 4,000 euros a month. It means for volume hiring, it makes a lot of sense. But this can also go up. Like, I mean, there's whole recruiting teams working for tech scale-ups, and then it can be, yeah, up there, that's for sure. And retained, I would say, is usually around 20% of the annual salary. It often comes with a replacement guarantee. We definitely do that. We give a replacement guarantee to the companies that we hire with to fill the role again in case the person should leave within an agreed time frame. And that again can also be a fixed fee rather than a flexible one based on the salary. All right, for all of these 3 different models, or all of the companies that you look at, rather than asking them, what's your fee? It is much better to vet your, which is important. You want to know the fee, granted you've got your budget, but you really want to ask them some questions about the level of how they work and how they will work with you, right? The first one I would always start with is to ask how to source your candidates. You know, if the main response is, well, we look on LinkedIn, then they're really not digging deep enough, right? Like, our sourcing includes state-of-the-art software, for example. We really aggregate profile and information that happen or public across the internet. Recruiters in specific fields, they really know their unique forums, whether that's Reddit, Discord, or even Quora, really creative approaches to sourcing candidates. Twitter, especially in that Web3 area, is super important. So really ask how they find those candidates. Yeah, and LinkedIn is simply not enough. The second question is how to approach a candidate, right? How to reach out, how to engage with them. Sending mass emails, it still happens, believe it or not, or like automated LinkedIn messages, again, isn't enough. It's not personalized enough. It won't cut through the noise for those top candidates that you want to engage. We've seen, especially in Germany, calling is still quite effective, but we also see outreach on Twitter, Facebook, Slack channels, Slack communities. You must know your way around, like be a little bit delicate here because you are in a community, especially with engineers, for example. And they're a creative and hyper-personalized outreach is super important, right? We use video, you can use engaging job descriptions, hyper-personalized messages, all of that married with automation is what we know how to do best. And that's really what you should look out for. Question 3 is the vetting process. So really understanding what the recruiter does before engaging or before presenting the candidate to you. Many recruiters just do a quick intro call, kind of check on the experience. Does that align with what's on the CV? And then they pass on the CV. That can work in some circumstances. Often it doesn't, especially for those more complex roles. You want to take your time, really vet and assess the candidates. For example, we develop a catalog of questions that we ask, and we develop that together with the client. So we already know what to ask and what to expect. We can filter out candidates, and we do that quite a lot, which ensures, on the other hand, for the company to really only see those candidates that are mostly relevant to them and not just someone who in that first call is just completely irrelevant. Another thing is that often recruiters try to repurpose candidates, meaning you build your large network of people that you speak with all day, and you can only place so many of them. You often have many more. So it's not a bad thing to have candidates repurposed, but what you need to watch out for is just having candidates being moved around quite a bit. What we do is we do another call with that candidate, of course, brief them about the new challenge, and then only move them ahead if they agree, right? Here again, a red flag would be a recruiter that just says you, oh, I'll just send you a few profiles later today. These are candidates I know are open to move, meaning they don't take the time to really brief that candidate on the opportunity and even understand if that's a relevant one for them. Fifth question, and last one for today, is a very good one. One of my recruiters told me this, and I love it. It's the question to ask: how would you sell our company? What would you highlight? And that really speaks to how well has the recruiter researched your company? How well do they understand it up to that point? You can really look out for very generic answers, but that kind of means that they haven't spent time on you. A really good one that we often do is give feedback on the employer brand as we perceive it on the internet, right? On websites, social media, and so on. And we can really point out what could be critical points in your employer value proposition and what we would have to, twist and, counter when approaching candidates. We also offer employer branding, by the way, quick plug here. So if an employer brand really isn't that great, we do help companies improve it. And upgrade it so that you can attract the best talent. All right, let's move on to finding success. You've chosen your model, you've chosen your firm. And the thing that I like to say is that a great recruiter will be able to find you the best candidate that's available to you right now in the market on the basis, of course, of your requirements and expectations, your budget, and your employer value proposition, right? So here I just wanted to list again, like the things Ben talked about, quite a lot of these things, is what we as recruiters like in a company, right? What we look out for when we engage with a company. The first one is that they must be ready to hire, right? If you're just there saying like, oh, let's see what's out there, the role's not really clear, priority, it's not a priority, you're wasting your recruiter's time, right? If you want to do a market exploration and you want to learn more about a candidate's geography or a talent map in a new region, we absolutely love to do that on a retained assignment. That is a great thing to do if you're not quite clear yet. So I think this can be an important one. But if you really want to hire, if you really want to engage successfully on filling a role, you must be ready to hire. You have to have a lean hiring process in place that is repeatable, right? And you make a confident hiring decision based on that process. You must have an attractive employer value proposition. That's to say, it's of course your compensation package, right? That's your salary, your benefits, everything that's monetary and non-monetary, but also your career development plan. What's your mission? All of this factors into the employer value proposition. And then you kick off, right? And then you go in and you give a good briefing, which I'll talk a little bit about in a second. Must give a good briefing and then invest time in that relationship, invest time in feedback, do those couple of rounds of adjustment, maybe look at a couple of profiles together, and then accept and act on feedback, whether that's from that initial stage or also when you get delivered a couple of candidates, the feedback that the candidates deliver, whether that's on your compensation package or your employer brand, or on the role, or also from your recruiter from the market itself. Really act on that feedback to improve your process, but also improve, as Ben said, not just the scorecard, but like generally, how does that role fit in? And it is that seesaw moment of, not going to, oh, I'll just take whatever is available in the market and what I need, right? But staying flexible there. I like to call it lean startup. Ben was smiling when I said that the first time. I think it's very similar in customer exploration as it is in candidate exploration, right? You want to learn from the market and then adjust and adapt a little bit what's there. But of course, you also want to be clear what your value proposition is. And lastly, there is to have a transparent process, right? When you work with a recruiter, that's super important. You need to know what you need generally, right? And you've got these different sources maybe where you get candidates from, right? Maybe you've only got one exclusive relationship with a recruiter and the recruiter handles everything. Then it's very easy to keep them up to speed. But if you've got some inbound candidates that the recruiter doesn't know about, it's very important to brief them on that as well. And if you've got people in the later stages. All right, last slide for me, to build a process with your recruiter, right? You've got your different steps to reach the finish line and really hire somebody, because in the end, that's what you all show up for, is to do a great kickoff with a briefing call that includes ideally a hiring manager and or someone from HR, but definitely try and get a hiring manager on there. They should be able to answer questions around the team, the culture, the roadmap. If you're an engineering team, maybe the feature release roadmap, the vision. Your requirements should be very clear. What are the restrictions on remote that we've mentioned before, which geographies, time zones, and so on. How do you hire? Do you hire on employment? Do you hire on contractor agreements? Do you hire through an employer of record? All of these are important. Your overall budget and compensation package for the role. And really give all of that to your recruiter. And then set a process, right? And say, okay, and I mentioned the sample profiles earlier, so I'm not mentioning them again, but set that communication structure of like, how are you going to touch base over the next 4 to 8 to 12 weeks, depending on how long the project is. We love weekly or bi-weekly check-ins, doesn't have to be super long, can be half an hour, which is where we deliver the feedback on candidates that are great for the adjustment for the search. We also use Slack Connect with a lot of our clients, where we have a direct Slack channel where we can just ping them a quick candidate profile, or we get a quick feedback. Staying in throughout the week communication like that is great as well. We also have a shared Notion page, which is a workspace, or even a Google document with briefing notes where everyone has an overview of the project. And really define that as the process for the next couple of weeks. And then you run your interviews, right? Your recruiter will go out, they'll do what we do, source, vet, interview, and so on. And you will do the same. So you'll get candidates in your influx, can be directly in your ATS, depending on which one you use. For example, with Greenhouse and Lever, it's very easy. Recruiters can put the candidates directly in there. We also have our own. So if a client doesn't have that yet, we can run all of that through our own ATS. We can share the candidates through that. So no CVs by email, it's all with unique links, and you can see the candidates there. Yeah, and then you run your interviews, you do your check-in calls, you adjust your process, right? In that circle, candidates will move further and further in the process. And then you make an offer, which is great, right? You find your candidate and you close them with our help, right? Like we stay in candidate communication, we stay in touch with them, but we're not overbearing, right? Like we're not trying to be the unnecessary middleman that all communication has to go through us, but a good recruiter kind of keeps the candidate engaged, is sure that they're in the process still, open questions, answering any of those. Yeah, and then follow up with them, even if they're rejected. Like we definitely make a point to touch base with them as well. Yeah, so when we're doing an RPO project, an in-house project, we handle everything, right? We handle the feedback to the candidate, the scheduling, the moving to the next steps, the rejections. But usually that is done in-house on a normal assignment. Yeah, and ideally in your ATS, exactly, you keep all of the information up to date so that your recruiter is briefed there as well. So when you make that offer, you can either, as soon as possible, inform your recruiter, or they see it in their ATS as well. Yeah, and there you can then also use that whole talent pool that you have to build a talent network. So when we work with our clients, that's usually what we do, especially on the RPO. When you go into a new geography, you want to build a future talent pool, right? As mentioned before, you build that roadmap. So there you go out and you already have that talent pool for your future hires. And then lastly here, during the onboarding, and I mentioned that briefly during the retained recruitment model, often you get a replacement guarantee from a recruiter, which is great, right? Like you can really trust that you'll have a person in that position. If it's not the first one that's working out, second one hopefully will, you learn a lot. Definitely touch base with your recruiter throughout the replacement period, keep them posted. If there are any red flags, the earlier your recruiter knows, the better, right? Because then they can already prepare and really make sure that that downtime is as little as possible, basically. All right, I think we've got one more slide with takeaways.
Yeah, we do. I just want to add here quickly, Angelina. I think
exactly.
it's really striking that what you describe here really is the success is very much contingent on the engagement of the client, right? And it's 100% the same in, for example, consulting and for any type of service, really, because it always involves the client, right? So level of engagement from the client is probably the strongest factor, if assuming you have a good firm, right? It's the strongest factor to influence on the success of the endeavor. And the other thing really is the talent network or the talent pool. Such an important thing to have because it allows you to be proactive with recruiting, and also if you have a clear organizational structure and a hiring roadmap in mind, right? If you have an idea of what you will need in a year's time, maybe, or 6 months time, then it becomes much more easier to be intentional about where to invest your time in nurturing this network, right?
Exactly.
But that's a very, very powerful tool. I agree.
Yeah, and that's a good recruiter will do that. So just getting 3 CVs of people and then hiring one and then the recruiter disappearing is not how you should work together. You should really work on building that talent network. And thanks for mentioning the collaboration again. I think my closing remark really was to say it is a common misconception that a recruiting firm is really a CV vending machine. Right? Some of them do that. They just pull them out of a drawer and like send them over. But recruiters can't magically deliver CVs that match all of your requirements based on your job description. It's gotten so much harder in the talent market that you really need to equip your recruiter and set them up for success, right? That starts with the preparation and it really goes into that engagement later on.
Yeah, great. Thanks for the insights there. All right, takeaways. Let's keep this very simple and jump on to the Q's and A's to close this off. But I think the takeaways are very obvious. First of all, know what you're hiring for, right? Be clear about the position that you want to fill and all the surrounding parameters that are included into this. And then spell out what type of company you are, right? So the recruiter needs to know what you're looking for and who you are. And the combination of these two things will enable them in this iterative collaborative approach to find the right candidates. And then, Angelina, if you allow me, I would just continue through, commit to the relationship. So basically, if you put out, if you distribute your eggs in 10 baskets, don't expect any hen to be very, very committed to you, right? So you have to commit to the relationship. So that based on role and business needs. So if you're hiring remote, find a remote recruiting firm. If you're hiring job or industry and location specific, find a firm that does exactly that. And the collaborative approach. And I think it's honestly, I think this is the key takeaway. It's as you said, not a vending machine. It's not a set it and forget it type of deal, but it's a collaborative thing. So yeah, that's very, very important. Looking at the time, and we have 2 questions. Let's jump right in here real quick from Sophia. Regarding the org structure and recruiting roadmap, are there any specific tools you could recommend? Well, I mean, what we usually use is just Miro or any other graphical tool because, org structures are as manifold as they come, right? And they all look different. But what we do is design today, design the future, draw a line pretty much as I did it, and then, have a timeline and decide when what is happening when, right? So keep it easy. It's more about the process than the tool, really. And then the second question is in reference to aspirational culture, exposing job descriptions or employer branding. What is the best way to create an honest pitch on my culture to not disappoint candidates, but still show my vision? Really, I would say a third-party vetting, right? So ask your team that are not involved into either leadership or hiring, but really just people who work in your company, how they would describe culture. Maybe you find third-party people or people that have left the company to describe the company, people that are more or less unbiased. That would be my suggestion. And then there's another question for Angelina. I read it out loud. My main question would be, what is the cornerstone to building a successful and productive relationship between my company and the recruiting firm, and how can Acework stand out there?
That's a good one. Yeah, so as we said, I think the building of a successful and productive relationship is really investing that time in building the trust. What we say is that our default mode of working together with our clients is called embedded recruitment. Some companies sell that as an add-on. For us, it's the default, right? It is that we really, at the beginning, do a super thorough briefing. We define a process together, right? We define those check-ins. We do a Slack connect. We do the ATS connect, and really be as close to our client as possible without being too annoying. Right? I think we've got also clients that are in the US, that prefer to do most of these things asynchronously just because of the time zone, but really fit into the process of the client there to really, make sure that the information flow is there. We're super transparent of our work as well. So every week we send an update with how many people we've reached out to. We send response rates. We send also negative answers, right? Or negative responses. What's the percentage there? We can give feedback if that's normal or not. Give some reasons there as well. So really feeding that information back to the client, so they're not sitting in a black box, right? And in return, we expect the same to also not sit in the black box, but really work together in that hiring process to find that person.
Yeah, I think that's a great answer. It's all about communication, right? Okay, second question from Sophia to you. How is retained, interesting one, how is retained search better for the company's bottom line than success fee-based relationship? So I would, I might ask the question like, why, how am I not paying more when I retain you instead of just paying a success fee? So how can I sell this to my CEO to get the budget approved? Asks Sophia.
Yeah, I think that's a really good one. So what we usually say is that retained doesn't cost more than purely success fee. It's just a different moment in time that you pay it. So retained is not more expensive than contingent by any means. What retained gives you is that it really allows you to have a committed recruiter to that role and not a contingent recruiter who maybe will get the full fee at the end, but only has a 20% chance of actually filling that role. So the 20% that Ben mentioned at the beginning, that was actually for companies that mostly work contingently, because then you take on 10 roles and you count on filling 2, right? And you rank them in terms of risks and then prioritize based on that as well. In retained, we see that, you take on way fewer roles because you get your financial commitment and you want to really start and not disappoint that client, right? Yes, of course you want the full fee, but it is about that relationship, right? So that commitment at the beginning, the financial commitment, really binds the two together to really fill that role rather than having a 20% chance of doing so. So in that sense, if you've got the success fee based contingent recruitment already approved, I think the step to go to your CEO and argue on retained search, it really isn't that big because the cost isn't bigger. All you do is you increase your chance of filling that position with the recruiter. If you're kind of hedging your bets and you want to see if a recruiter can send a couple of profiles, but you're actually relying on in-house recruitment, of course, then it's either your in-house, which doesn't cost you an external added amount, or your recruiter. I think there you really got to figure out what's the best strategy for you. Do you want to put your resources on something that an expert can do, or do you want to try and fight that expert and really only take the top candidate from it, which we've seen that where the bar for the external candidate is 5 times higher than for the one who comes inbound, because the inbound one is free on paper, but again, when you look at an ROI, the great candidate will probably outperform the inbound candidate, even though they're more expensive, right? So it really is quite interesting sometimes the biases that go on in hiring. we could
Yeah.
talk a whole hour about this, the psychological aspects of that.
No, but
I think we can.
it's
kind of
great to
point
outline that, you know, that it's not different costs just distributed differently from a cash flow perspective, but what you get is the buy-in of the recruiting firm and the dedicated work, and not a, you know, it feels like venture capital investing. This, you know, I take on 10 and assume that I can only fill 2. You know, so I think retained recruiting
Exactly.
for more complex roles sounds like an interesting alternative.
Yeah, absolutely.
All right, Angelina, thank you so much. Thank you so much. Thank you so much. It was really, really interesting. I myself must say I learned a lot about how this industry works, and it was a pleasure sharing these insights with all of you. So I hope you enjoyed it too. We will send out the recording after this, and also provide you with a checklist on, you know, that you can use to walk through your recruiting or your recruitment firm hiring process to make sure you don't miss out on the important things we touched on today. Angelina, any closing remarks from you?
I think all has been said. Thank you, Ben.
Thank you so much. Have a nice afternoon, everyone. Bye-bye.